You know when you look at medieval art and you wonder, why does it seem so flat? Especially compared to those incredibly lifelike statues from ancient Greece and Rome. Well, it wasn't because artists just, forgot how to draw. Not at all. It was a deliberate choice, a complete reinvention of what art was even supposed to do. So let's dive into how a brand new faith completely changed the game for the art world.
Right. This is the big mystery we're tackling. You have these amazing, realistic sculptures of Roman emperors, and then, almost overnight it seems, we get these stylized, symbolic figures, often against a flat gold background. So what happened? Well, to figure this out, we need to understand the huge problems that the early Christian church was facing.
And you can really see the difference here. On one side, you've got Greco-Roman art. It's all about copying and perfecting the world you can see. But on the other side, early Christian art, it's all about explaining the world you can't see. The main goal wasn't realism anymore. It was all about spiritual truth. And that right there changed absolutely everything.
Okay, so to get to the bottom of this, here's our roadmap. We're going to start with the new challenges that came with being a new state religion. Then, we'll see how they solve those problems, first with architecture and then with a totally new way of thinking about painting. We'll also see how things played out a little differently in the East and West. And finally, we'll wrap our heads around the incredible legacy of this whole transformation. All right, so our story kicks off with a massive political and religious earthquake. Christianity goes from being this persecuted minority faith to suddenly becoming the dominant power in the Roman Empire. And this created some brand new, very big challenges. The year is 311, and Emperor Constantine decides to throw the full power of the Roman state behind the church. I mean, think about that. Suddenly, this religion has to operate on a massive imperial scale, and there's no instruction manual. They had to figure out their traditions, their worship spaces, their art, pretty much overnight. And right away, they run into two huge problems. First up, the space problem. Christianity is all about people gathering together in big groups to worship. So, where do you put thousands upon thousands of new worshipers? And second, you've got the image problem. How do you decorate these huge new churches without, breaking one of your most important commandments?
So let's tackle that first problem, space. The old models, the pagan temples, they just weren't going to cut it. The solution they came up with was, frankly, brilliant, and it shaped what churches would look like for the next 1,000 years.
You see, a Greek or Roman temple, think of the Parthenon, was really just a fancy house for a statue of a god. All the important rituals happened outside. They were never meant to hold big crowds. But Christians needed the exact opposite, a giant indoor hall where everyone could gather. So they had to look for a different blueprint. And they found their answer in the Roman Basilica. Now, this wasn't a religious building at all. It was a public hall used for things like law courts and business. But it was big, it was impressive, and it was perfect for holding a crowd. They just took that existing design and repurposed it for worship. Problem solved.
Okay, so they figured out where to worship. But the question of how to decorate these huge new basilicas? Whoa, that was way, way trickier. It kicked off this intense debate that went right to the very core of their faith.
See, at the heart of it all was the second commandment. This was a really big deal for them, a clear line in the sand that separated them from the pagan religions they were replacing. The rule was crystal clear, and the fear was real. The worry was that people would start worshiping the statue itself instead of the God it was supposed to represent. And that's the sin of idolatry.
So that meant those realistic, life-size sculptures were seen as way too close to the heathen idols they've just gotten rid of. For the most part, statues were just out. They were banned from churches. The artistic tradition of ancient Greece, which had been perfected for centuries, was deliberately cast aside.
So if statues are a no-go, what do? I mean, are you just going to leave the massive walls of these new basilicas totally empty? Of course not. Instead, the church came up with a powerful new reason to create a different kind of art. Two-dimensional art, like paintings and mosaics.
And this gets right to the heart of it. The vast majority of people back then couldn't read or write. So how on earth are you supposed to communicate these incredibly important, complex stories and ideas to them? How do you make your faith understandable for everybody?
And the solution they landed on, wow. It's summed up perfectly in this quote from Pope Gregory the Great. And honestly, this might be one of the most important sentences in the entire history of art. He said, "Painting can do for the illiterate what writing does for those who can read." Think about that. He's giving art a whole new job description.
It's not just for decoration. It's not about capturing reality. It's for teaching. It's a tool for mass communication.
So art became this kind of visual language, a sacred story written on the walls. The goal was no longer to make you say, wow, that looks exactly like a real person. The goal was to make sure you understood the story of a saint's life or Christ's sacrifice instantly and clearly.
And this led to a whole new rule book for artists. First, the sacred story is everything. All other details have to serve that story. Second, make the meaning crystal clear. Use simple, easy-to-recognize symbols so everyone gets it. And third, forget about realism. Things like perspective, shadows, perfect anatomy, they just weren't important. What mattered was the eternal spiritual truth, not the messy physical world.
Now, while this idea was taking root in the Western, Latin-speaking part of the Roman Empire, a slightly different and way more intense debate was going down in the Eastern, Greek-speaking part of the empire, what we now call Byzantium.
I mean, this wasn't just some polite disagreement. For more than a century in the East, a violent conflict raged. On one side, you had the iconoclasts, literally the image smashers, who believed all religious art led to idolatry and should be destroyed. And on the other, you had those who defended the images, arguing that they were crucial to the faith. In the end, the defenders of images won out, but they used a different line of reasoning. So in the West, art was seen as a kind of storybook for those who couldn't read. Super useful, but still just a tool. But in the East, the icon became something more. It was seen as a sacred object in itself, like a holy window that gave you a glimpse of the divine. And this key difference is part of what led to the two distinct traditions we know today as Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox.
So let's bring it all home. This huge shift in thinking, which was born from some very real practical and religious problems, ended up setting the course for Western art for the next 1,000 years.
The amazing techniques of classical realism, they weren't lost. They were just put aside on purpose because art had a new, much more important job to do. It was no longer a mirror held up to the physical world, but more like a map that pointed the way to the spiritual one. It was a complete revolution in how people saw the world, built on the idea that spiritual truth was actually more real than physical reality.
And this whole story kind of forces us to ask a bigger question, doesn't it? We sometimes think the purpose of art is this fixed, unchanging thing. But history shows us it can be completely reinvented. So it makes you wonder, if art's purpose could shift so dramatically from imitation to explanation all those centuries ago, what's its most important job today? Definitely something to think about. Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer.